There is a special kind of nausea reserved for family gatherings where the smiles are fake and the greed is palpable. You watch them toast to legacy while secretly calculating how to pick your pockets. I am Lucy Rogers, and for years I was the invisible daughter, the one my parents ignored while they worshipped my incompetent brother. But today, on my father's 70th birthday, they made a fatal mistake. They tried to cannibalize my nephew's future to pay for their own debts, assuming I was too weak to stop them. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The heat in the garden was oppressive, but it was nothing compared to the storm I was about to unleash. The heat in the garden was oppressive, a humid, suffocating blanket that seemed to trap the scent of expensive cologne and oversweetened iced tea against the manicured hedges. It was my father's 70th birthday, a milestone that required by unwritten family statute a performance of absolute perfection. The lawn of the Rogers estate had been transformed into a stage set of white linen tablecloths, crystal glassware, and carefully arranged floral centerpieces that cost more than my first car. I stood near the edge of the patio, swirling the ice in my glass, observing the tableau with the detached, analytical eye I usually reserved for board meetings. To the dozens of guests mingling on the grass, I was simply Lucy, the quiet daughter, the one who lived in the city and did something in administration. They saw a woman in her late 20s who had yet to marry or produce a grandchild, a supporting character in the vibrant, loud saga of the Rogers dynasty. They did not see the youngest sitting member of the Board of Trustees at one of the nation's most prestigious universities. They did not see a woman who managed philanthropic endowments worth millions. In this house, my resume was invisible, redacted by the blinding glare of my family's preference for my older brother Mark. I watched Mark now holding court near the bar, his hand resting possessively on the shoulder of his son Leo. Leo was 18, brilliant, and possessed a quiet humility that seemed genetically impossible given his lineage. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight as Mark gestured expansively with a Scotch glass, spilling a few drops on the grass. My parents, Bill and Martha, stood flanking them, beaming with a pride so intense it looked painful. It was a familiar scene, a precise reenactment of the hierarchy that had governed my entire life. Mark was the sun. We were merely the planets hoping for a bit of warmth. Watching them fawn over Leo, I felt a familiar sharp ache in my chest, a phantom pain from an old wound I thought had healed into scar tissue years ago. The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow, pulling me back 5 years. It was the day of my master's graduation. I had graduated summa cum laude, top of my class in educational administration, ready to embark on a career that would demand every ounce of my intellect. I had saved a row of seats in the auditorium, watching the doors with desperate hope as the procession began. They never came. I walked across the stage, accepted my diploma, and looked out into a sea of strangers. Later, I found a text message from my mother. "So sorry, honey. Mark got that promotion to assistant regional manager, and we promised we'd take him to dinner to celebrate. We know you understand. You're always so independent." The promotion was minor. My degree was a lifeline I had built for myself. I didn't cry that night. Instead, I went to a quiet diner, ordered a coffee, and made a vow. I would never again look to them for validation. I would build a life so substantial, so grounded in competence and integrity, that their approval would become irrelevant. And I had. "Lucy, stop hiding in the shrubbery and come join the family." My father's voice boomed across the patio, jovial but commanding. I composed my face into a pleasant mask, the same neutral expression I wore during contentious budget hearings, and walked toward them. "Happy birthday, Dad," I said, kissing his cheek. The skin felt papery, smelling of sandalwood. 70 years, he declared, puffing out his chest. "And look at this legacy, Mark leading the business, and now Leo about to take the academic world by storm." "He certainly is," I said, offering Leo a genuine smile. He returned it with a look of desperate gratitude, his eyes pleading for rescue. "Have you decided on a university yet, Leo?" Mark answered for him. "He's going to the state university, obviously, but not just as a regular student. We're applying for the big one. Mark took a dramatic swig of his drink. The Rogers Family Legacy Scholarship. My heart stopped, then restarted with a slow, heavy thud. The Rogers Family Legacy Scholarship. It was a generic name designed to sound like old money, respectable and vague. It's perfect timing, my mother chimed in, adjusting her pearls. We were just talking about the logistics. It's such a generous award, full tuition plus that massive living stipend. It's a very competitive scholarship, I said quietly, testing the waters. Well, sure, for regular people, Mark scoffed, clapping Leo on the back so hard the boy stumbled forward. But the name is Rogers. Dad knows people on the alumni board. We figure it's practically ours to give, and thank God for it. That stipend is going to be a lifesaver. A cold dread began to pool in my stomach. A lifesaver for Leo's books and housing, you mean? Mark laughed, a wet, dismissive sound. Leo doesn't need $40,000 a year for books, Lucy. He's a kid. He'd just waste it on video games. No, we've got a plan. Dad and Mom are going to manage the disbursement. We figure we can use the stipend to clear out the loan on the SUV, which, by the way, I use to drive Leo around, so it's a valid educational expense, and whatever is left over will fund the family trip to Italy next summer. A cultural experience for the boy. I looked at Leo. He was staring at his shoes, his face burning with shame. He knew. He knew exactly what this was. This wasn't support, it was a harvest. They were looking at his intellect and seeing a payout. Is that allowed? I asked, keeping my voice dangerously even. Usually scholarship funds are restricted. Details. My father waved his hand dismissively. It's a family scholarship, Lucy. The money stays in the family. It's about stewardship. We know what's best for the funds. Besides, who's going to check the donor is anonymous. Probably some dead guy who forgot he even signed the check. The irony was so sharp I could taste blood in my mouth. They were standing on the precipice of a moral abyss, preparing to cannibalize their grandchild's future to fund their own luxuries, justified by a twisted interpretation of family values. They assumed the world worked the way they wanted it to, that connections trumped rules, that the name on the building mattered more than the integrity within it. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know that 3 years ago, when my investments in educational technology paid off beyond my wildest dreams, I had approached the university chancellor. They didn't know I had written a check for $2 million to endow a scholarship specifically for students demonstrating resilience in the face of adversity. They didn't know that I had named it the Rogers Family Legacy Scholarship, not to honor them but to challenge them, a test I had hoped blindly that they might one day pass. I was the anonymous donor. I was the dead guy. The signature on the endowment charter was mine. It sounds like you have it all figured out, I said, my voice barely a whisper. The air around us seemed to vibrate with the tension of the unsaid. Mark was already calculating the exchange rate for euros. My parents were preening over their benevolence. They were vultures circling a feast they hadn't caught, unaware that the game warden was standing right beside them. We do, Mark said, grinning. It's going to be a great year. Finally, the system gives something back to us. I looked at Leo again. He looked up, and for a fleeting second, our eyes locked. I saw the resignation of a young man used to being an asset rather than a person. I realized then that my passivity was over. I couldn't just be the aunt who sent nice birthday cards. I had to be the trustee. I had to be the dean of this situation. They wanted to play games with a legacy fine. I would teach them a lesson in true governance. The appetizers hadn't even been served, but as far as I was concerned, the party was over. The lesson was about to begin. I excused myself from the suffocating humidity of the garden, murmuring something about needing to check on the dessert arrangement. It was a polite fiction, the kind of social lubricant that kept families like ours from grinding their gears until they shattered. I slipped through the French doors and into the cool, climate-controlled silence of the house, heading straight for my father's study. The room smelled of lemon polish and unread leather-bound books, a sanctuary of performance, much like the party outside. I closed the heavy oak door, leaning against it for a moment, to let the mask drop. My heart was hammering not from fear, but from the adrenaline of imminent action. I walked to the window watching my brother down another scotch on the lawn and pulled my phone from my clutch. I dialed a number saved simply as Chancellor Evans. It rang twice. Lucy. The Chancellor's voice was warm, authoritative, and respectful, a stark contrast to the dismissal I had just endured outside. I didn't expect to hear from you on a Saturday. Is everything all right with the board agenda? The agenda is fine, Margaret, I said, keeping my voice low. I'm calling about the Rogers Family Legacy Scholarship, specifically the pending application for Leo Rogers. Ah, yes, your nephew, a stellar academic record. Admissions flagged him as a top-tier candidate regardless of the endowment. We were planning to send the acceptance packet next week. Send it now, I instructed, my tone shifting into the professional cadence I used in the boardroom. Electronic approval effective immediately. But Margaret, I need to verify the disbursement protocols we discussed when I drafted the charter. Of course, she replied, the shuffling of papers audible on the line. Clause 4, paragraph B, the direct-to-institution mandate. All funds are routed strictly to the university bursar for tuition room and board. Any surplus for books or supplies is held in a university-managed debit account restricted to campus vendors. No cash withdrawals, no transfers to private accounts. And no exceptions. None. That's the ironclad condition you stipulated. Why is there a concern? Let's just say I'm conducting a stress test on the family integrity. I said, watching Mark laugh at something my father said, his hand clapping Leo's shoulder with a heaviness that looked like ownership. Please ensure the formal award letter highlights that clause. Bold text. No ambiguity. Consider it done. I'll email the official PDF to you within 5 minutes, and the physical copy goes out Monday. Thank you, Chancellor. I hung up. The trap was set. It wasn't a malicious trap. It was a safety net woven from bureaucratic steel. I took a deep breath, centering myself. I wasn't just the little sister anymore. I was the architect of the very future they were trying to mortgage. I left the study intending to find Leo, but I was intercepted in the hallway by Mark. He was leaning against the wall near the kitchen, loosening his tie. His face was flushed, a sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the air conditioning. He looked at me with a glassy, patronizing grin. Hiding in the house, Luce? He asked, pushing off the wall. Dad was asking where you went. Can't have an empty chair when the toasts start. Just taking a work call, Mark, I said, stepping around him. He chuckled, stepping into my path to block me. It was a move he'd used since we were teenagers, using his physical size to dominate the space. Work call, right. That little administrative job keeping you busy? They paying you overtime for weekends? I manage, I said, my voice flat. Look. He lowered his voice, leaning in conspiratorially. The smell of scotch was pungent. I was actually meaning to talk to you. I know things can be tight for you in the city. Rent, cost of living, all that single income struggle. If you need a loan, just to tide you over until you find a husband or a better gig, let me know. The absurdity of it nearly made me laugh. Mark, who I knew for a fact was upside down on his mortgage and leasing 2 luxury cars he couldn't afford, was offering me charity. It was a power play. He needed to feel like the patriarch, the provider, even if it was built on a foundation of sand. That's very generous, Mark, I said, maintaining the facade. But I'm doing okay. Suit yourself. He shrugged, his expression shifting from pity to greed in a blink. Because things are about to get really good for us. Once this scholarship kicks in, the pressure is off. Dad and I were running the numbers. That stipend is insane. 50 grand a year for living expenses. Do you have any idea what 50 grand can do for a budget? It's for Leo, Mark, I reminded him. For his education. Leo is 18, Lucy. He doesn't know a distinct asset from a liability. Mark snapped, his jovial mask slipping. He's part of this family. His success is our success. I've supported him his whole life. It's payback time. That money belongs to the household. Just then, the kitchen door swung open and Leo walked in, carrying a tray of empty appetizers. He looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped. When he saw Mark, he flinched a microscopic reaction, but to me, it was screaming. "There you are!" Mark boomed, his mood swinging back to aggressive exuberance. He snatched a piece of paper from his jacket pocket and slammed it onto the granite island. "Put the tray down, Leo. We need to handle some business before the cake." Leo set the tray down, his hands trembling slightly. "What is it, Dad?" "Just some paperwork for the scholarship," Mark said, smoothing the document out. I glanced at the header, General Durable Power of Attorney. "Since the money is coming in your name, we need to make sure Mom and I can access the accounts to manage it for you. Pay the bills, handle the investments. You know adult stuff. You don't want to worry about taxes and audits while you're studying, right?" I thought the school handled the money," Leo asked, his voice small. "Don't be naive," Mark scoffed, uncapping a pen. "The school takes their cut, but the stipend comes to you. And you're going to sign this so I can make sure it doesn't get wasted, unless you don't trust your own father." The manipulation was textbook. Mark was weaponizing Leo's loyalty, turning his son's hesitation into an insult against the family. Leo picked up the pen, looking trapped. He was a good boy, raised to honor his parents even when they didn't deserve it. He looked at me, his eyes wide with panic. "Mark," I said, stepping forward. "The guests are waiting for the refills. Leo can't sign legal documents in the kitchen in the middle of a party. It won't even hold up without a notary." "I'm a witness," Mark challenged, his jaw tightening. "And Dad's a notary. We can do it right now." "Not now," I said firmly. I didn't shout, but I infused my voice with the steel I used when denying tenure. "Dad is halfway through a bottle of wine. You've been drinking scotch. Leo is exhausted. If you make him sign that now, any lawyer could have it thrown out as coercion in a heartbeat. Do you want to risk the scholarship over a procedural error?" Mark hesitated. The mention of losing the money spooked him. He snatched the paper back. "Fine, Monday morning, first thing. But don't think you can weasel out of this, Leo. This is for the family." Mark stormed out, taking the tray of empty plates with him to look busy, leaving a wake of toxic energy in the kitchen. The silence that followed was heavy. Leo leaned against the counter, burying his face in his hands. "I can't do this, Aunt Lucy. I can't say no to him. He talks about how much he sacrificed for my hockey gear for my tutors. If I keep the money, I'm stealing from him." I walked over and gently pulled his hands away from his face. "Look at me, Leo." He looked up, tears brimming in his eyes. "You are not an investment vehicle," I told him, my voice fierce and low. "You are a student, a scholar. Parents support their children because it is their duty, not because they are buying futures contracts on their earnings. What your father calls sacrifice is just parenting. You do not owe him your future." "But he'll hate me," Leo whispered. "If I don't sign, he'll say I'm ungrateful. He'll turn Grandma and Grandpa against me." "He might," I admitted, refusing to lie to him. "But that is a reflection of his character, not yours. You are about to enter a world that values merit, Leo. Hard work, integrity. You cannot build a life on a foundation of appeasement." My phone buzzed. The email from Chancellor Evans. I opened the PDF, verified the bold text in Clause 4, and nodded. "Leo," I said, reaching into my purse. I didn't have a printer, but I had the original acceptance letter I had carried with me, the one I had intercepted from the mail pile at the university before it was sent, intending to give it to him myself. I pulled out the thick, cream-colored envelope embossed with the university seal. "What is that?" "This is your acceptance," I said, handing it to him. "And inside is the detail about the scholarship. The real detail, not the fantasy your father has constructed." He took it, his fingers brushing the raised seal. Does it say I have to give him the money?" "I want you to keep this sealed," I commanded gently. "Put it in your inside jacket pocket. Do not open it until you are asked to speak during the toasts. When you stand up there and they are looking at you expecting you to fold, I want you to open this. Why? Because the truth is inside that envelope, I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. Your father thinks he's fighting a boy he can bully. He doesn't know he's fighting an institution. You don't have to argue with him, Leo. You just have to read the terms. I'm scared, he admitted. Good. That means you understand the stakes, I said. But you are not alone. I will be right there. I'm not just your aunt today, Leo. I'm your witness. And I promise you the one holding the pen has the power. Tonight, that's you. He took a deep breath, straightening his tie. The fear was still there, but something else was kindling behind his eyes, a spark of defiance. He tucked the envelope into his blazer, right over his heart. Okay, he said. Okay. Let's go, I said, opening the kitchen door. It's time for the toasts, and I think the family is due for a lesson in economics. The sun had begun to dip below the tree line, casting long, dramatic shadows across the white tablecloths, bathing the party in the deceptive golden glow of early evening. It was the magic hour, a photographer's dream. But to me, the light felt exposing, stripping away the soft edges of the afternoon and leaving everything in stark, high-contrast relief. Waiters circulated with bottles of expensive Cabernet filling glasses that were already dangerously low. The ambient chatter of the guests' neighbors, business associates of my father, members of the local country club, had reached that boisterous pitch that precedes the speeches. I sat at the main table, my hands folded in my lap, watching the condensation bead on my water glass. To my left, Leo sat rigid, the envelope I had given him burning a hole in his pocket. To my right, Mark was practically vibrating with anticipation, his earlier anxiety masked by the liquid courage of 3 more scotches. My father stood up, tapping his spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The sharp ting-ting-ting cut through the laughter, bringing the garden to a hush. He smoothed his tie, beaming with the expansive, flushed satisfaction of a patriarch who believes he has conquered the world. Family and friends, my father began, his voice booming without the need for a microphone. 70 years is a long time. You see a lot of things change in 7 decades, but some things remain constant, like the Rogers bloodline. He paused for applause and he got it. We are a family of builders, of doers. And today on my birthday, the greatest gift isn't wrapped in a box. It's the promise of the future. He gestured grandly toward Leo. My grandson Leo, the first of the next generation to head off to university. More applause. Leo stared at his plate, his ears turning red. And not just any university, Mark interjected, standing up to join our father, unable to let the spotlight linger away from him for too long. He slung an arm around Dad's shoulders. We're keeping it in the family, folks. Leo is applying for the Rogers Family Legacy Scholarship. It's a full ride, tuition board, and a very, very healthy stipend. Mark scanned the crowd, grinning. Let's just say the family trip to Italy next summer is getting an upgrade. First class thanks to the boy here. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. Someone shouted, "Way to go, Leo!" That's right, my mother added from her seat, raising her glass. It's such a blessing. We've all worked so hard to get him here. It's only right that the scholarship gives a little back to the family unit. It takes a village after all, and sometimes the village needs a vacation. They were doing it. They were publicly staking their claim, converting Leo's academic potential into social currency and literal cash before the acceptance letter had even arrived in the mail. They were normalizing the theft, wrapping it in the language of family unity, so that no one would question why a 40-year-old man was spending his son's scholarship money. The guests smiled and nodded, unwitting accomplices to the graft. I looked at Mark's face, smug, entitled, greedy. He didn't see a son. He saw a winning lottery ticket. I pushed my chair back. The sound of the wooden legs scraping against the patio slate was harsh, a discordant note in their symphony of self-congratulation. I stood up. Actually, I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it was projected from the diaphragm, a technique I had mastered for lecture halls. It cut through the murmur instantly. That won't be possible. Mark blinked, his smile faltering. Sit down, Lucy. We're doing the toasts. I am toasting, I said, my eyes locking on his. I'm toasting to accuracy and to governance. My father frowned, looking confused. Lucy, what are you talking about? Don't ruin the mood. The Rogers Family Legacy Scholarship. I continued, addressing the guests, now turning my gaze from face to face. It is indeed a prestigious award. It was established 3 years ago with a specific mission to support students who demonstrate intellectual fortitude and independence, but there seems to be a fundamental misunderstanding about how it works. It's family money, Lucy. Mark snapped, his voice dropping an octave, an edge of warning creeping in. We decide how it works. No, I said. The Board of Trustees decides how it works. And the donor decides the terms. The donor is anonymous, my mother hissed, looking around nervously to see if the neighbors were watching. Stop making a scene. The donor was anonymous, I corrected her. Until tonight. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my phone, though I didn't need it. I knew the statutes by heart. 3 years ago, I endowed the Rogers Family Legacy Scholarship with a personal donation of $2 million. My money, my earnings, my legacy. The silence that descended on the garden was absolute. It was a vacuum sucking the air out of the lungs of everyone at the head table. Mark's mouth opened, but no sound came out. My father looked at me as if I had suddenly spoken in tongues. You. Mark finally sputtered, a laugh of disbelief bubbling up. You're an administrator, Lucy. You push papers. You don't have $2 million. I am the youngest member of the University Board of Trustees, I said, my voice cold and hard as iron. I was an early investor in the educational software platform the university now uses nationwide. My paper pushing has been quite lucrative, Mark. But I kept it quiet because I wanted to see if you would value me for my character rather than my net worth. I think we have our answer to that. I turned back to the guests who were now watching with rapt, horrified attention. However, I went on, wealth requires stewardship. When I wrote the charter for this scholarship, I included a specific clause. Clause 4, paragraph B, the direct-to-institution mandate. The scholarship covers 100% of tuition, room, and board. Those funds are transferred electronically from the endowment directly to the university bursar. They never touch the student's hands. They never touch the parents' hands. I turned to look at Mark. And as for the stipend, it is restricted to a university-monitored debit account. It can only be used at the campus bookstore, the dining halls, and approved educational vendors. It cannot be withdrawn as cash. It cannot be transferred to a personal checking account. And it certainly cannot be used to purchase airline tickets to Italy. Mark's face went from red to a pale, sickly shade of gray. You can't do that. It is already done, I said. The money is for Leo's education, not your debts, not your lifestyle, not your validation. It is his shield, and I have made sure it is impenetrable. You did this on purpose, Mark shouted, losing his composure entirely. He slammed his hand on the table, rattling the silverware. You set us up, you let us think. I let you reveal yourselves, I interrupted. I let you show Leo exactly where he stands in your ledger. You were ready to cannibalize his future to pay for your past mistakes. This is outrageous, my father bellowed, trying to regain control of the narrative. Lucy, you have humiliated your brother on my birthday. You have stolen family resources. I have protected family potential. I shot back, my voice finally rising to meet his volume. I stepped in because you failed Dad. You failed to protect him from your own greed. The tension was thick enough to choke on. The guests were looking down at their plates, desperate to be anywhere else. Mark looked ready to lunge across the table. Then a chair scraped. Leo stood up. He didn't look like the terrified boy in the kitchen anymore. He looked tall. He looked like a Rogers, but the version of the Rogers family I had been trying to build, not the one that currently existed. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the cream-colored envelope I had given him. Leo, sit down, Mark growled. Don't you dare side with her. She's trying to cut us off. Leo ignored him. He didn't look at his father. He didn't look at his grandparents. He turned his body slightly so he was facing me, and then he looked out at the crowd. I want to say something, Leo said. His voice shook on the first syllable, but then it steadied. He held up the letter. This is my acceptance letter. Aunt Lucy gave it to me before dinner. I haven't opened it yet. He tore the seal. The sound was crisp in the silent garden. He unfolded the heavy paper and scanned it. A small smile touched his lips. It confirms everything Aunt Lucy said, Leo announced, looking at the paper. The Rogers Family Legacy Scholarship. Chair of the selection committee, Ms. Lucy Rogers. He looked up, and for the first time he looked directly at his father. Dad, Leo said, his voice surprisingly deep, stripped of its usual deferential whine. You asked me yesterday what I was going to major in. Actually, you didn't ask. You told me to major in business so I could handle the money. You never asked me what I loved. You never asked me what I wanted to be. He turned to me. Auntie Lucy asked. 3 years ago, she asked me what books I was reading. She sent me articles about political science and history. She asked me questions and actually waited for the answers. Leo took a step away from the table, physically distancing himself from his parents. I am accepting this scholarship, he declared. And I am accepting the terms. I don't want the cash, Dad. I don't want the Italy trip. I want to learn. And I am grateful to the only person in this family who thought my mind was worth more than the check it could bring in. He raised the letter like a toast. To Auntie Lucy, he said, his voice ringing clear. Thank you for being my role model. And thank you for ensuring that my education belongs to me. The silence broke. It didn't break with applause that would have been too Hollywood. It broke with a collective sharp intake of breath from the guests. The shame in the air was palpable. It radiated off my parents and Mark like heat off pavement. They stood there dressed in their finery, exposed as moral paupers by an 18-year-old boy. Mark slumped back into his chair, defeated not by a shout, but by a thank you. My father looked at me, his eyes wide, seeing the stranger he had raised, realizing too late that while he was building a facade, I had been building a fortress. I raised my glass to Leo. To your future, Leo, I said softly. It's all yours. The aftermath of truth is rarely the explosive cinematic shattering of glass that movies promise. Instead, it is a suffocating, heavy silence, a vacuum where the air suddenly feels too thin to breathe. In the wake of Leo's toast, the garden party didn't end so much as it dissolved. The guests' well-heeled neighbors and business associates who prided themselves on their social grace found themselves staring into the raw, exposed nerves of a family dysfunction they were never meant to see. There was no applause, no laughter, only the clinking of a fork against a plate from a table in the back, and the distant hum of traffic, the sounds of a world that had continued turning while ours ground to a halt. Mark sat slumped in his chair, his face a rictus of shock. The fight drained out of him not by force, but by the sheer, undeniable weight of the contract Leo had just verbally signed. My mother was frantically signaling the catering staff to clear plates that were still half full. Her smile fixed and brittle, a desperate attempt to glue the veneer of perfection back onto a structure that had already collapsed. I looked at Leo. He was still standing, his chest heaving slightly, the adrenaline of his defiance beginning to ebb into a tremble. He looked terrified, but he also looked lighter, as if a physical weight had been lifted from his shoulders. I caught his eye and nodded toward the French doors. It was time to go. We had made our point. Staying to watch the wreckage burn would only be cruelty, and my goal was correction, not destruction. Get your coat, Leo, I said quietly, my voice carrying only to him. We're leaving. You can't just walk out, Mark rasped, finding his voice, though it lacked its usual bluster. He sounded small, like a child who had been told the game was over. It's Dad's birthday. We haven't even cut the cake. I think we've had enough celebration for one evening, I replied, placing my napkin on the table with deliberate precision. Happy birthday, Dad. I'll call you next week. My father didn't answer. He was staring at the empty chair where Leo had been sitting, his hands gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white. For the first time in my life, he looked his age. The robust, commanding patriarch had vanished, replaced by a confused old man, realizing that the currency he had traded in control and bluster had just been devalued to zero. I lingered for a second, feeling a pang of pity. It is a terrible thing to realize you have bet your legacy on the wrong child, and an even worse thing to realize you were the one who rigged the game against yourself. I didn't need to be a telepath to hear the internal monologue screaming behind his eyes. The humiliation was etching itself into the lines of his forehead. He was replaying every dismissal, every skipped graduation, every moment he had prioritized Mark's chaotic dependency over my quiet competence, and realizing that his investment strategy had been flawed from the start. "Come on," I whispered to Leo, guiding him away from the table. We walked through the house, the silence of the hallway amplifying the sound of our footsteps. It felt like an escape. We stepped out the front door and into the cool evening air, the humidity finally breaking. My car, a modest but reliable sedan, was parked at the end of the driveway, away from the least luxury SUVs Mark insisted on driving. As we got in, I looked back at the house one last time. Through the bay window, I could see the silhouette of my father still sitting at the head of the table, isolated, while the guests began to make their polite, hurried exits. He was the king of a crumbling kingdom, left to rule over the silence he had created. I started the engine, and we drove. We didn't speak for the first 10 minutes. We just let the distance accumulate between us and the estate, measuring our freedom in mile markers. I drove us away from the manicured suburbs and toward the edge of town, pulling into the gravel lot of a 24-hour diner with a flickering neon sign that simply read "Eat." It was the antithesis of the garden party, unpretentious, grounded, real. We slid into a vinyl booth near the back. The waitress, a woman with kind eyes and tired feet, dropped 2 laminated menus in front of us. "Just coffee for me," I said, "and a slice of cherry pie." "I'll have a burger," Leo said, his voice cracking slightly, "and a vanilla shake, please." When the waitress left, Leo exhaled a long, shuddering breath that seemed to deflate his entire frame. He looked at me, his eyes wide. "I actually did it." "You did?" I confirmed, pouring sugar into the coffee the waitress had already dropped off. "How do you feel?" "Like I'm going to throw up," he admitted with a weak laugh. "But also, good. Really good." "Did you see Mark's face? Dad's face?" "I saw." "He's going to be so angry," Leo said, the anxiety creeping back in. "The car, the trip. He was banking on that money, Aunt Lucy. What is he going to do?" "He is going to get a job," I said simply. "Or he is going to sell the car. Or he is going to downsize. He is going to do what adults do when they cannot afford their lifestyle. He is going to face reality." I reached across the table and covered Leo's hand with mine. "And that is not your problem. You are not his bailout fund. You are his son. If he can't distinguish between the two, that is a failure of his character, not yours." "It felt mean," Leo whispered, "embarrassing them like that." "Correction," I said, leaning in. "They embarrassed themselves. You simply refuse to participate in the lie. There is a difference between malice and boundaries, Leo. Tonight you set a boundary. It hurts because you've never done it before, like using a muscle that's atrophied. But it was necessary. If you had signed that power of attorney, you wouldn't just have lost the money. You would have lost your self-respect. And that is a currency you can never earn back." The food arrived. Leo ate with the ravenous hunger of a teenager who had been too knotted up with stress to eat the appetizers at the party. I watched him, seeing the transformation. He was no longer the prop in my father's pageant. He was a young man with a future. The diner, with its smell of grease and coffee, felt infinitely more holy than the country club atmosphere we had left behind. This was America, the ability to start over, to build something from nothing, to sit in a booth and define your own destiny, regardless of who your father was. My phone buzzed on the table, a text message. I hesitated, expecting a barrage of angry texts from Mark. But it wasn't Mark. It was a notification from the security system at my parents' house. I was still on the contact list for emergencies. System armed, perimeter secure. The party had ended early. Then a second vibration. A text from my father. Just 3 words. You were right. I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in my coffee cup. It wasn't an apology, not yet. But it was an admission. It was a crack in the armor. He was sitting in that house amidst the leftover cake and the half-empty wine bottles, and he was finally doing the math. He was realizing that while Mark offered him flattery, I had offered him the truth. He was realizing that by trying to control the legacy, he had almost destroyed it, and that the only way to save the family name was to let the next generation define it on their own terms. "Everything okay?" Leo asked mid-bite. I turned the phone over screen down. "Yes." I smiled, feeling a genuine sense of peace for the first time in years. "Everything is exactly as it should be. Eat your burger, scholar. You've got a lot of studying to do starting in the fall." We sat there for another hour, 2 refugees from a war of expectations finding sanctuary in the quiet hum of the diner. The fallout would continue. There would be awkward phone calls and angry voicemails from Mark, but the hardest part was over. We had escaped the orbit of their greed. The cord was cut. And as I looked at Leo discussing his potential course load with a brightness in his eyes I hadn't seen in years, I knew the Rogers family legacy was finally safe. Not because of the money, but because it was finally in the hands of someone who understood what it meant to earn it. The seasons change with a predictable rhythm that human nature rarely emulates. Winter strips the trees bare with a brutal honesty, forcing the world to endure the cold before it can bloom again. It had been 6 months since the implosion at the garden party. 6 months since I had driven my nephew away from the wreckage of my father's expectations and into the autonomy of his own life. The silence from the estate had been absolute for the first few months, a frost that settled over the family lines. I didn't chase them. I focused on my work on the board meetings and on the quiet, steady reports I received from the university regarding Leo's progress. He was thriving, pulling a 3.8 GPA and working part-time in the library, a stipulation I hadn't enforced, but one he had chosen for himself. He was building a character brick by brick. Then the letter arrived. It wasn't an email or a text message, the preferred disposable mediums of my brother. It was a heavy cream-colored envelope, addressed in my father's sprawling, jagged handwriting. I sat in my office, the city skyline gray and steel behind me, and held the paper for a long time before opening it. The stamp was crooked, a small imperfection that betrayed a trembling hand. Inside, there was a single sheet of stationery, the header embossed with the family initials that now seemed less like a brand and more like a question. "Dear Lucy," it began. "The house has been quiet since August. Too quiet. Your mother and I have had a lot of time to sit in the garden and look at the empty chairs. When you left, I was angry. I felt you had staged a coup, but anger is often just fear in a loud coat. I was afraid of losing control, and I was afraid of the truth you put on the table. You were right. We were eating the seed corn. We were so focused on maintaining the image of the Rogers family that we forgot the values that were supposed to support it. You held up a mirror, and I didn't like the old man I saw in it. It took a lot of courage to do what you did. You didn't just save Leo's tuition. I think you might have saved his soul. And perhaps mine. I would like to see you. We would like to come to the university." I folded the letter, running my thumb over the crease. It was an apology without the word sorry, which for a man of my father's generation was a seismic shift. He had acknowledged my agency. He had admitted that my tough love, that distinctly American medicine, was the cure they had needed. We arranged to meet on campus a week later. It was a crisp, bright afternoon, the kind of day that makes a university look like a postcard for optimism. I waited for them near the clock tower, standing on the very pavement that my endowment had helped pave. When they arrived, the dynamic was visually different. My parents walked slower, holding hands stripped of the frantic need to impress. And trailing behind them was Mark. Mark looked different. The bloated arrogance that came from unearned leisure was gone, replaced by a leaner, tired look. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was in a windbreaker and slacks. The least luxury SUV was gone, replaced, I learned later, by a used sedan he had bought with cash. "Lucy," my father said, stopping a few feet away. He looked at me, not as his little girl, but as a woman who commanded respect. He extended a hand, then thought better of it and pulled me into a stiff but genuine hug. "Thank you for seeing us." "Hello, Dad, Mom," I said, stepping back. I looked at Mark. "Mark." He nodded, looking at his shoes before meeting my eyes. There was shame there, but it was a clean shame, the kind that burns away the rot. "Lucy, I got a job. Regional sales for a HVAC supply company. It's a grind, commission-based." "That's honest work, Mark," I said. "There's dignity in it." "Yeah." He let out a short, dry laugh. "That's what Leo told me when I called him. The kid is lecturing me on work ethic now." "He had a good teacher," my mother said softly, looking at me. "We all did." We walked together toward the student union. The conversation was halting at first, but it found a new footing. For the first time, my father asked me about my work, really asked. He wanted to know about the endowment structures, the board's strategic plan, the complexities of higher education finance. He listened to my answers with the focus of a student nodding as I explained the difference between liquid assets and restricted funds. He realized that the daughter he had ignored was the financial heavyweight he had always pretended to be. The hierarchy of age had dissolved, replaced by a meritocracy of competence. I was no longer the child at the kids' table. I was the dean of the family table. We found Leo in the quad, sitting on a stone bench with a stack of books. When he saw us, he didn't flinch. He stood up smiling and walked over to hug his grandparents. Then he turned to his father. Mark stiffened, expecting rejection, but Leo extended a hand. "Hey, Dad," Leo said. "How's the new job?" It's hard, Leo," Mark admitted, shaking his son's hand. "But I'm paying down the cards. It's going to take a while. No Italy trip this year." "That's okay," Leo said, and he meant it. "I'm studying abroad in London next semester anyway, on a grant I applied for. I got it on my own." Mark looked at his son, really looked at him, and for the first time I saw pride that wasn't possessive. "Good," Mark choked out. "That's good. You earned it." We stood there for a moment, the five of us framed by the red brick and ivy of the institution. The wind blew through the trees, scattering the last of the autumn leaves, clearing the way for winter and the spring that would inevitably follow. The tension that had defined our family for decades, the need to appear wealthy rather than be worthy, had broken. It had been painful, yes. It had required a confrontation that nearly severed us. But as I looked at my father leaning on his cane but standing taller than he had in years, and at Mark tired but finally useful, and at Leo free and bright, I realized the scholarship had paid its dividends. "You know," my father said, looking at the statue of the university's founder in the center of the quad, "I always thought a legacy was what you left behind in the bank account. I thought it was the name on the trust fund." He turned to me, his eyes wet. "I was wrong. This," he gestured to Leo and then to me, "this independence, this strength to stand on your own 2 feet without needing me to prop you up, that is the legacy. I'm sorry it took me 70 years to learn the difference between price and value." "You learned it, Dad," I said, taking his arm. "That's what matters. Class is never truly dismissed." He squeezed my arm. "Well," he said, taking a deep breath of the cold, clean air, "I think it's time we let you buy us lunch, Madam Trustee. I hear the dining hall takes debit." I laughed, a sound that felt light and unburdened. "Actually," I said, leading them toward the hall, "I think today I'll treat you. My treat. No strings attached." We walked across the lawn together, a family reconstructed not by greed, but by the hard, necessary grace of the truth. The wound had healed, The scar remained, but it was no longer a mark of injury. It was a line of demarcation separating the past we had survived from the future we had finally earned the right to build. And that brings us to the close of Lucy and Leo's journey. It serves as a powerful reminder that a true legacy is built on character, not just a bank balance. If you found satisfaction in seeing justice served today, please consider subscribing to the channel for more stories like this. What did you think of Lucy's approach? Let us know below because we read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.